Today we're going to be exposing one of the most corrupt studies ever published in the medical literature, and that is Study 329. Now, the sponsor of this study, GlaxoSmithKline, used it to support the use of the SSRI antidepressant medication Paxil in children and adolescents. There was only one problem with this, however. Study 329 didn't show that. In fact, Study 329 showed that this drug did not work and it in fact made adolescents suicidal. But you should be asking yourself the question, how did this study get published? Because if you know anything about medical journals, for something to get published, it has to go through peer review. These are usually high-ranking, prestigious medical doctors who look at the paper to see whether it passed muster. And even after that, it has to go to a journal editor who uses his own ethical judgment to determine whether the trial has scientific validity and whether it's true. Well, those things failed in this case, and the result was that GlaxoSmithKline earned billions and kids died. And so what we're going to be talking about in today's video is how something like this can happen in one of the most advanced medical communities in the world, where your first oath is to do no harm to your patients. And so we should set a little bit of context for this story. And the context is that in 1987, Prozac comes onto the market. Now, this is the first SSRI antidepressant, and it changes the world. It is a blockbuster, and it leads to billions in sales. A lot of other companies looked at this, and they quickly rushed to develop their own SSRIs. And the second one on the market was Paxil or paroxetine. And this was developed by SmithKline, which later became GlaxoSmithKline. And this blockbuster drug was seeking to expand its market share. It was thinking, how can we outsell Prozac? How can we become the biggest name in the market? And they eventually ended up succeeding in doing that. And part of this strategy was to expand use into adolescents. They wanted children and adolescents to use their drugs so they could make more sales. But there was only one problem with this. Some of the earlier studies that looked at SSRIs in this population, they didn't really find an effect. And so enter Study 329. This was a clinical trial funded and designed by GlaxoSmithKline to change the narrative around this. And so what the clinical development team did was they designed a multi-center trial that compared Paxil, paroxetine, their SSRI drug, against imipramine, which is a very old antidepressant, and placebo. And so there were 3 different arms. And they were going to assess how depression improved at the end of 8 weeks on the drug. Now that sounds reasonable, but there's a little bit of technical detail here that's important for you to understand. When you're measuring improvement in a clinical trial, you need to select 2 primary outcomes, which is essentially a fancy way of saying you need to decide what are you going to say is success. Now in Study 329, they said that they wanted the primary outcome to be a 50% drop in the HAM-D score. HAM-D score is essentially a rating scale for depression, and a statistically significant mean change in the depression scores on the HAM-D. There's nothing too surprising about that. That's quite normal for clinical trials. But here's what they found. What you're looking at is a table from the clinical trial, and we're going to highlight the sections that are important. The first place I want to draw your attention to is this item here on the bottom line. It says HAM-D total score. And if we go across to the paroxetine group, what we find as the HAM-D total score is actually that it drops to 8.24 in the paroxetine group. And if you go all the way over to placebo, because that's what we want to compare, it dropped actually to 9.88. Now, just to put this in context for you guys, the Hamilton rating scale for depression is a 52-point scale. So a 1-point difference is really nothing on a scale of that magnitude. On top of that, over here what you're seeing is a p-value. You see a p-value of 0.13. Now this is not statistically significant, but you don't even need to really look at this p-value to say, well, this didn't really work because a 1-point difference on a 52-point scale is really not that big of a deal. This has failed on this endpoint. Now, if we go up here to have a look at the other endpoint here, which is a 50% reduction on the HAM-D score at week 8, what you find here is that 66.7% of people met that threshold compared to 55.2%, but this was not statistically significant as well. It had a p-value of 0.11. Some of that's a little bit technical, but just to make it clear for you, this is essentially a failure on the 2 primary endpoints. Now, moving on to the safety data, what did they find? Well, they found that in the patients who were taking paroxetine, they had a whole range of psychiatric adverse events, such as worsening depression, emotional lability, and then in parentheses, they say suicidal ideation and gestures. So these kids were having suicidal thoughts and what looks like a suicide attempt. On top of that, they had conduct problems, hostility, and signs of mania like euphoria and expansive mood. And some kids were even hospitalized. And essentially, most people would look at this and say, this is a failed study. Our hypothesis was that it was going to show an improvement on those two primary outcomes that we just talked about. It failed. And on top of that, we're seeing some pretty nasty safety signals as well. And initially, this was actually acknowledged by GlaxoSmithKline in this memo that we have here. And I'll read it. It says, as you will know, the results of the study was disappointing and that we did not reach statistical significance on the primary endpoints, and thus the data do not support a label claim for the treatment of adolescent depression. So what does that mean, a label claim? Well, they were trying to use this study to get the FDA to update the labels so they could market the drug to adolescents and children legally. Essentially, they're acknowledging here that they can't do it with this study. Now, an ethical pharmaceutical company at this point would have said, well, this is unfortunate. We should probably publish it so people know that Paxil isn't a safe drug to use in children and adolescents. And this could also have a broader implication for other SSRI medications in kids because they are of a similar class. But that, in fact, is not the end of the story, because here is what happened. Afterwards, the medical affairs team from GlaxoSmithKline, which is essentially the marketing arm that markets towards doctors, who are the people who write prescriptions for this medication, they actually went out and they retained a ghostwriting firm. And that ghostwriting firm was Scientific Therapeutics Information. And they gave them this data and they paid them $17,000 to essentially develop a manuscript about this study to put the drug in a different light. And you'll see what I mean in a moment, because this was the end result that was published in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. And here's what it says in the results. Paroxetine demonstrated significantly greater improvement compared to placebo in the HAM-D total score less than 8, HAM-D depression mood item, KSAD-L depression mood item, and CGI score of 1 and 2. That doesn't seem right. And they concluded that paroxetine is generally well tolerated and effective for major depression in adolescents. Now, how on earth could they do something like this? Well, it comes down to something that we call cherry picking the data. Now, I want to take a step back here because sometimes this can be a little bit technical. So I used to work in the pharmaceutical industry, so I know how they do these studies. Anytime you do a clinical trial and you're investigating depression, you may use like 3 different scales. You may use something called the HAM-D, the KSAD, you may use the CGI. These are all just different measures. You're essentially collecting data to see, how is this drug working on different endpoints? So here's what they did. They essentially went through the data and they cherry-picked different outcomes in there that actually met statistical significance. And that's what's highlighted here. Well, for instance, they picked the HAM-D less than 8 score at the 8-week endpoint. And they said, well, for people who got less than 8, it actually separated from placebo. So that's interesting. And then they said, in the HAM-D, if we get rid of all of the items, now remember there's 17 items in the HAM-D, they got rid of all of them and they said, well, on the depressed mood item, that was actually statistically significant. And they grabbed that one. And then they also did it for the KSAD-L. And they found the depressed mood item and they found that as well. And then they picked something else that was really arbitrary, a CGI score of 1 or 2. Now, CGI scores, I believe they go up to 5. And so they were saying, the people who got a 1 or 2, there was slightly more of them in paroxetine than placebo. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, that's kind of interesting, Josef. I would want to know that. And what's wrong with them presenting this data in this way? Maybe there's something useful to that. But here's where I need to use an analogy, and that is the throwing the spaghetti at the wall analogy. Remember in the past, I talked about the importance of picking a primary outcome. You want to pick a primary outcome because it keeps you honest when you're doing a clinical trial. You design a study in a way where you say, I think this is where I want to see the improvement, and I'm going to design the study around that. Now, if you remember, they didn't meet efficacy on the 2 primary endpoints that they thought was good, the HAM-D total score, and then also the 50% reduction from baseline. So it failed on the primary efficacy mark. So that's a negative study. So the problem with data diving and kind of finding these things is it's very post hoc. And if you are like, say, for instance, you have 50 different items in a study, you do 3 different scales to measure the effects. And within those scales, there's different items in there where you can see if they differentiate. Just by random chance, a lot of the time, you're going to find some statistically significant differences. And that's why I say it's like throwing spaghetti at the wall. If you throw enough stuff up there, randomly, you're simply going to find some areas that are going to differentiate to a statistically significant degree. And that's what happened here. Now, the problem with how they published this was that remember, if you go back here, they don't even mention in the abstract, in the results, so the high-level summary that most doctors read, most doctors aren't diving through the data. In the results, they do not mention that it failed in the primary efficacy results. They they completely ignore it, and they simply present the things that they cherry-picked, which is really misleading. And so that's what they did with the efficacy. Now, if you come down here to actually the safety data, this is where it's even darker. We're going to zoom in on the nervous system adverse reactions here in table 3. Now, I want you to go down to emotional lability. And it says, okay, 6.5% in paroxetine and 1.1% in placebo. Okay, well, yes, there's an imbalance there, about a 6-to-1 imbalance. And, well, I guess it's just emotional lability. Now, the issue with this is that emotional lability isn't actually emotional lability. That was a euphemism title that they selected to essentially hide suicidal events. Remember what I showed you before? It said that kids who were coded as emotional lability actually had suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. And so again, it's another way of hiding serious adverse events that people would be interested in. Now, this should be so disturbing to anyone listening to this, because how did this even end up getting in the medical journal to begin with? Because if you look at this, the authorship line here, these are all leading child and adolescent psychiatrists. This is an authorship line to die for. These are the most authoritative people in the field. I mean, Martin Keller was a professor at Brown when this happened, so an Ivy League institution. How did they allow this to happen? Well, I'm going to explain how. Oftentimes, academics will simply allow their name to be put on papers because it helps their careers. Now, this is extremely unethical, but this is going on a lot. And so the way this happens in the pharmaceutical industry, where I used to work, is that you hire a medical publishing firm. Remember, in this case, they used STI, and the paper was actually written by Sally Layden, who really minimized the truth and just kind of manipulated it to represent the drug in a positive way. So Sally would have prepared the manuscript, and she would have given it to these authors. Now, these authors would have read over it, and they would have signed off on it. Now, a very sad truth about this is that many of these academics, they don't really dig into the data that much, and they take the company at their word, because that requires a lot of effort. Because if you want to sign off on the way the data was presented or the adverse events, you would have to go through all of that, and it would take several hours. Or you could just read it and say, yep, that sounds pretty good. Yeah, you can put my name on it. And all of a sudden you get a publication, you get a feather in your hat, it builds your CV, and before you know it, you get a promotion at work. That's essentially how academic medicine works. And so STI was able to shop around and find a bunch of academics, very prestigious key opinion leaders, to put their name on this paper that was essentially false. And before you say to me, Josef, that sounds so unethical, how could professors at these institutions do this? I want to tell you this isn't an isolated event, because what I'm showing you here on the screen is an exhibit that was found from a previous lawsuit with a pharmaceutical company about sertraline. And I want to highlight this here because they were doing the same thing at this time. It has this study here about sertraline versus placebo, and it's for a poster presentation in Europe at a big conference, and it says author TBD. Now, what the heck does that mean? Well, it means that the paper has already been written by the medical publishing company, and now they're shopping around to find authors to put their name on it. The authors of medical papers are oftentimes not the real authors. It's usually someone behind the scenes at the pharmaceutical company, and then they essentially put their name on it to use their authority and the institution that they come from to launder the information. And so when other doctors look at it, they say, oh, Martin Keller, I trust Martin Keller. I know I can trust what's in this paper. He was the author. And the drug companies know this, and that's exactly why they do it. And so this paper ends up getting published in a pretty good journal. And here's what happens next. Now, remember when you saw that memo before and it said it didn't meet the efficacy endpoints and they couldn't use it for marketing? Well, they found a way around that, because once they had this article published in this prestigious journal with all these great names on the authorship line, here's the memo that they sent to their sales department. They said this is a cutting-edge landmark study. It's the first to compare the efficacy of an SSRI to a TCA, that's that older antidepressant, and placebo for the treatment for major depressive disorder in adolescents. Paxil demonstrates remarkable efficacy and safety in the treatment of adolescent depression. The sales rep for the company are now armed with this paper, and they are going out to PCP offices around the country, psychiatry offices. They're talking at conferences, and they have this article, and they're saying things like, well, have you thought about using this drug in some of your depressed kids? And the doctors there would say, well, I don't really know if that's safe or not. And then they would pull up that article and they'll say, hey, here are the results and here's the conclusion. It says paroxetine is generally well tolerated and effective for major depression in adolescents. And they say, well, can I really trust this? And they go, oh, look, this is Martin Keller. He was the lead author, professor at Brown. Who the hell are you to doubt this? And many doctors look at this and they say, oh, well, I guess you're right. I trust medical journals. I trust the peer review process. And so I'm going to believe this. And what was the result? Well, the result was this. And I looked this up on Wikipedia. Paxil sales crossed $11.7 billion. That's how much money they made selling this drug. And so this was an incredibly effective marketing tactic to increase their market share. But thankfully, the story doesn't end there because history does catch up with them. And so although Study 329 is happening around the 2000s or around the new millennium, it's only in 2012 that the Department of Justice announces the largest healthcare fraud settlement that's ever happened. And this is against GSK. And they were looking at many different drugs there, but in many ways, a big focus of this federal lawsuit was on Paxil, particularly on Study 329, where they found that there was proof that they were marketing it off-label illegally. And to this, GSK pleaded guilty and they paid the $3 billion fine. And really, there was no secret about the fraud that had taken place with Study 329. For instance, this is an excerpt from justice.gov. This is a press release. They say the government alleges that from 1998 to 2003, GSK unlawfully promoted Paxil for treating depression in patients under age 18, even though the FDA never approved it for pediatric use. The United States alleges that, among other things, GSK participated in preparing, publishing, and distributing a misleading medical journal article that misreported a clinical trial of Paxil that demonstrating efficacy in the treatment of depression in kids under 18. When the study failed to demonstrate efficacy, GSK did not make available data from other studies where Paxil failed to demonstrate efficacy in treating depression in kids under 18. And so they were caught with their hand in the cookie jar and they were punished to the tune of $3 billion. And so it was clear as day that what they were doing was essentially marketing a drug that didn't work and a drug that was known to cause suicide attempts. I mean, it's right here in the drug labels. After 2003, 2004, it became clear that all SSRIs increased the likelihood of suicidal events in children and adolescents. I cannot stress how evil it is to do something like this, how ethically compromised you have to be to put profits of a drug above kids killing themselves. But shifting gears now, what about the authors? These doctors that took an oath to do no harm, and the medical journal editor who clearly didn't do his job and should probably be fired. What happened to them? And the fact is that nothing has happened to them so far, despite many academics and ethical people in medicine calling for the retraction of this fraudulent medical article. And the first group that really looked at this was David Healy's group. And back in 2015, after they got access to all of the hidden documents from this pharmaceutical lawsuit, they went and they analyzed the clinical trial data. And here is what they found. They found that 11 kids on Paxil had serious psychiatric adverse events. Now, that's out of 93. There were only 93 kids on them. So that's like 1 in 9. And those events included suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. And none of that happened in the placebo group. On top of that, remember all those secondary outcomes that they reported in the results, like right on the front page in that summary of it? They found out that these were all post hoc analyses. No one had said, hey, this is what we're really interested in. It was confirmed that this was purely data dredging and they were just searching around for anything that was statistically significant that benefited the drug. And so that was really bad. And so they used this to ask the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry to retract this study. But they refused. And do you want to know what their rationale was? The rationale was that, and I quote, the paper contains no inaccuracies or negative findings, and all of the results were included in the results tables, and therefore there is no grounds for its withdrawal. Well, that may be true because if you look here at this table, they've listed all of them. And if you look here at the fine print, yes, they did say that they hid suicidal ideation and gestures amongst emotional lability. But if you come back to the high-level summary, Again, the thing that most doctors read because they're busy and they can't read a 3 or 4 page article and they want to read the cliff notes and they trust that this is reliable. If you look there, they don't even mention it. How could you not mention that a study failed the primary endpoint that the whole study was built around? How could you not mention that 10% of the people on Paxil had serious adverse side effects, including suicidal ideation and suicide attempts? It is completely misleading and it is hiding the most important information in the study. Well, I'm really happy to report to you that that was not the end of the story, because this year, attorney George Murgatroyd III, an attorney who has represented several families whose children have died by suicide after Paxil. These are families whose lives have been destroyed by this misleading article. George Murgatroyd filed a lawsuit against the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Elsevier, which is the publisher. And the claim was that distributing this paper as valid science violates consumer protection laws and that they are continuing to profit from paid downloads from the paper. Well, that is certainly true. But on top of that, it's completely ethical and wrong, and all of them should be fired and their medical licenses should be taken away. But if this is the first step, let's go for it. And so, understandably, the families whose children killed themselves because of this drug have demanded full retraction of the paper. I wonder why. Yeah, they don't want other kids to die from misleading information. And so recently now, if you go and look at the article, it says there's an expression of concern about this article and that further review is now underway. Well, it's a little bit too late because this article came out in the early 2000s and we've nearly had 25 years where kids have been hurt because of this. And so I want to come to this end of this video and I want to raise this point. How much money do you need to be given to compromise your integrity? Well, for GSK, it was $11 billion. They were happy to do it for $11 billion. A couple kids dying along the way is fine. For SDI Therapeutics, this was the medical journalism firm, it was $18,000. For Martin Keller, it was $500,000, which he had been receiving from pharmaceutical companies each year for consultancy work, and for a couple references on his CV. For medical journals, it seems to be about $30 a download from an article. That seems to be enough for them. And unfortunately, for most psychiatrists working in the United States these days, it's okay to do this for around $300,000, especially if you have some loans, you have to look after your family. Yeah, it feels off the way we're doing things, but for $300,000, I guess this is just the way the world works. And I want to bring this up with you because drug company money has infiltrated psychiatry. And this isn't something that just happened a couple decades ago. It's something that's still happening today. And when we look at our psychiatric leaders and the things that they tweet, they should be up in arms about this fraud. They should be up in arms about kids dying from misleading information about the drugs. But all they seem to be interested in, unfortunately, are social issues. Well, I would say you can be interested in social issues. They're important. If you want to talk about racism or financial inequality, do it. But only do it after you've actually fixed your profession. Engage with the actual things that you're paid to do, that you're actually meant to be good at. Don't sit there and grandstand over social issues. And for me, I have to say, I'm really happy with what George Murgatroyd is doing right now, because this is not an isolated incident. Right now, we have another study which needs to be retracted. It's called the STAR-D trial. This is the study that is constantly being talked about in the news in the United States, and it is saying that antidepressants are essentially effective, when in fact, most of the effect goes away at the end of 2 years. In fact, the STAR-D study actually found that only 3% of people who were put on antidepressants stayed well. They have buried the lead. And so this is the next paper that needs to be retracted if psychiatry is going to regain its credibility. If you want to learn more about that, be sure to check out this video over here where I go into the shaky evidence base supporting the use of antidepressants.